The fluorescent lights of the Chicago Historical Society's basement archive hummed softly as Dr. Rebecca Martinez carefully lifted the yellowed photograph from its protective sleeve. Her gloved hands trembled slightly, not from the October chill that seeped through the old building's walls, but from anticipation. After 3 decades of working as the institution's lead archivist, she had learned to recognize when something truly extraordinary lay before her. The photograph, measuring 8 by 10 inches, depicted a bustling Chicago street scene. Horse-drawn carriages lined the wooden sidewalks. Men in dark suits and bowler hats walked purposefully past storefronts. Women in long dresses clutched shopping baskets. Children played near a lamppost. The image quality was remarkable for 1871, capturing details that later fire-damaged photographs from that era could never preserve. The buildings stood crisp and clear, their wooden facades adorned with hand-painted signs advertising dry goods, tobacco, and fresh bread. Rebecca's colleague, Thomas Chin, a photography historian from Northwestern University, leaned closer with a magnifying glass. "The exposure is perfect," he murmured. "Whoever took this knew exactly what they were doing. Look at the shadow angles." This was taken in late afternoon, probably between 4 and 5 o'clock. October 8, 1871, Rebecca read from the faded notation on the photograph's backing. The dates written in period ink. "Thomas, do you understand what this means?" Thomas straightened, his eyes widening behind his wire-rimmed glasses. The Great Chicago Fire started around 9 that evening. "Exactly. This photograph was taken just hours before everything in this image was reduced to ash." Rebecca set down the photograph with reverence. These people had no idea that within 5 hours, their entire world would be burning. The discovery had come about through sheer chance. An elderly woman named Dorothy Brennan had passed away at 97, and her grandson, clearing out her Evanston home, had found a locked trunk in the attic. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and protected by layers of yellowed newspaper, were dozens of photographs, letters, and documents. The grandson, a history teacher at Lincoln Park High School, had recognized their potential historical value and contacted the Chicago Historical Society. Rebecca had spent the past 2 weeks cataloging the collection. Most items were family portraits and documentation of various Chicago businesses from the 1870s and 1880s. But this particular photograph stood apart. The timestamp, the location, the clarity, everything about it screamed significance. "We need to verify the exact location," Thomas said, pulling out his laptop. "If we can pinpoint where this was taken, we might be able to identify some of these people. Census records from 1870 and 1871 might give us names." Rebecca nodded, her mind already racing ahead. The store signs are legible. Murphy's Dry Goods. Callahan's Tobacco. I can cross-reference these with the business directory from 1871. She paused, studying the faces frozen in time. "Look at them, Thomas. They're just going about their day. That woman there, with the basket, she might be buying vegetables for dinner. That man checking his pocket watch, probably worried about being late for an appointment. None of them know." Thomas was already typing rapidly. "I'm pulling up fire insurance maps from 1871. If we can match the building facades and street layout." He rotated the laptop screen to show Rebecca. "I think this might be South DeKoven Street, near the O'Leary property." The name hung in the air between them. Catherine O'Leary's barn, located on DeKoven Street, was where legend claimed the fire had started, supposedly when her cow kicked over a lantern. Modern historians had largely debunked this story as anti-Irish propaganda, but the location remained historically significant as the fire's origin point. "That would place this photograph within 2 blocks of where the fire began," Rebecca said quietly. "These people were standing at ground zero." Over the next 3 days, Rebecca and Thomas worked 16-hour shifts, driven by an urgency neither could quite explain. They contacted colleagues across the country, fire historians, photography experts, architectural specialists. Everyone wanted to see the photograph. Dr. James Whitmore, a leading expert on the Great Chicago Fire from the University of Illinois, made the drive to Chicago within 24 hours of Rebecca's email. He stood in the archive room, studying the photograph through a high-powered loupe, and simply shook his head in wonder. "In all my years researching the fire, I've never seen anything like this," Whitmore said. "We have photographs of the aftermath. We have illustrations and paintings of the fire itself. But pre-fire photographs of the affected area? They're extraordinarily rare. Most were destroyed in the flames. This is..." He struggled for words. "This is like having a photograph of Pompeii taken the morning of the eruption." Rebecca had been comparing the photograph to fire maps and surviving architectural documentation. "I've confirmed the location. This is De Koven Street, specifically the 100 block. This building here," she pointed to a 3-story wooden structure with ornate trim, "was the Peterson boarding house. It housed about 20 people. The building next to it was the McConnell family home. All of it burned." Thomas had been working with census data and city directories. "I think I've identified some of the people. This man here, standing in front of Murphy's Dry Goods, that's likely Patrick Murphy himself. Irish immigrant, came to Chicago in 1856, built his business from nothing. He was 43 years old when this photo was taken. According to fire records, he lost everything but survived. Moved to Milwaukee afterward." "What about the others?" Whitmore. "The woman with the basket, I believe that's Margaret Sullivan. She worked as a seamstress, lived in the Peterson boarding house. She was 28. She..." Thomas paused, consulting his notes. "She died in the fire. They found her body 3 days later in the basement of the boarding house. She'd apparently gone back in to try to save some children." The archive room fell silent. Rebecca found herself staring at the woman's face, captured forever in that moment of ordinary existence. Margaret Sullivan had been alive when this photograph was taken, worrying about ordinary things, planning for a future she would never see. "The children?" Rebecca asked softly. "Survived. She got them out first, then went back for their toys or belongings. Accounts vary. The smoke got her." Thomas's voice was rough with emotion. "She's buried in Calvary Cemetery. Her gravestone just says her name and dates. Nobody remembered her as a hero." Over the following week, they identified more faces. William Chen, a Chinese laundryman, standing in his doorway, just 25 years old. He survived the fire but lost his business and life savings. Henry Schaefer, a German baker, aged 51, photographed loading bread into his cart. He died of smoke inhalation while trying to save his ovens. He'd spent his life building his bakery and couldn't bear to leave it. Anna Novak, a Czech immigrant and mother of 4, visible in the photograph's background, carrying a baby. She and all 4 children survived, but her husband died fighting the flames. 7-year-old Timothy O'Brien, the boy playing near the lamppost, who would grow up to become a Chicago alderman, spending his career improving fire safety regulations. Each identification added weight to the photograph. These weren't just anonymous faces from history, they were real people with names, families, dreams, and in some cases, tragically short futures. Rebecca arranged for professional digital scanning of the photograph using the latest high-resolution technology. The scans revealed details invisible to the naked eye. Window displays showing the prices of goods. A cat sleeping on a windowsill. A torn poster on a wall advertising a theater performance. Expressions on faces. A smile here, a look of concern there, a child's curiosity, an old man's weariness. "What strikes me most," Rebecca told a gathering of historians and journalists she'd invited to view the photograph, "is how completely normal everything looks. This could be any American city on any autumn afternoon in 1871. There's no indication of impending disaster. The weather was dry, yes, the city had been experiencing a drought. But nothing in this image suggests that these people had any reason to fear what was coming." A reporter from the Chicago Tribune raised her hand. "Do we know who took the photograph?" "We believe we do," Thomas replied. "Based on the technical quality and the equipment required to achieve this level of detail, plus cross-referencing with photographer directories from the era, we think the photographer was Alexander Hesseler, one of Chicago's premier photographers. He had a studio on Lake Street. He survived the fire but lost his entire studio and years of work. He would have been 47 when he took this. Why was he on DeKoven Street that day? Another reporter asked. Rebecca smiled. That's where our story really begins. To understand why this photograph exists, we need to go back to that day, October 8, 1871. We need to understand not just what happened, but who these people were in the hours before their world changed forever. Alexander Hessler wiped the sweat from his forehead despite the October chill. The drought had left Chicago tinder dry, and even the afternoon breeze carried an unsettling warmth. He adjusted the heavy camera on its tripod, double-checking the angle. The street scene before him was perfect, busy enough to show life but not so crowded that people would blur into incomprehensible motion during the exposure. Hold still now, he called out to no one in particular. Most people on the street ignored him. Photographers were common enough in Chicago, though usually they worked in studios, not on public streets. But Hessler had a commission from a wealthy businessman who wanted documentary images of various Chicago neighborhoods. The man was considering real estate investments and wanted a record of the city's current state. Patrick Murphy emerged from his dry goods store, squinting at Hessler's camera setup. How long must we freeze, Mr. Hessler? His Irish accent was still thick despite 15 years in America. Just another moment, Mr. Murphy. The light is perfect right now. In 20 years, people will look at this photograph and see Chicago as it was in its glory. Hessler ducked under the camera's black cloth, making final adjustments. Murphy chuckled. Glory? This ramshackle street? You should photograph Michigan Avenue if you want glory. But he stood still, understanding the importance of documentation. Everything in Chicago was new, raw, temporary feeling. The city had exploded in population over the past decades, now approaching 300,000 souls. Buildings went up fast, made mostly of wood because it was cheap and quick. Murphy's own store had been built in just 6 weeks 3 years ago. Margaret Sullivan walked past, her basket heavy with vegetables from the market. She'd spent her last dollar on the food but didn't mind. Sunday was her only day off from sewing in the stuffy workroom above Callahan's tobacco shop, and she wanted to prepare a good meal for the other boarders at Mrs. Peterson's. Life in Chicago wasn't easy for a single Irish woman, but it was better than starvation in County Cork. At least here she could work, could eat, could maybe even save enough someday to bring her younger sister over from Ireland. Excuse me, miss, could you pause for just 10 seconds? Hessler's voice carried across the street. Margaret stopped, confused, then realized the photographer wanted her in his picture. She felt suddenly self-conscious of her worn dress, her work-roughened hands, her mended shawl. But she stood still, basket on her arm, and counted to 10 slowly in her head. When Hessler called out his thanks, she continued on her way, wondering if anyone would ever see that photograph, wondering if she'd ever see it herself. Inside his laundry, William Chen was finishing the day's last batch of shirts. The smell of lye soap and hot starch filled the small shop. He'd been in Chicago for 3 years now, having come from San Francisco after hearing that the rapidly growing city needed laundry services. The work was backbreaking and the prejudice was constant. He'd been spat on twice just this week, but he was saving money. His wife and son were still in China, and every shirt he washed brought him closer to affording their passage to America. He stepped into the doorway to check the weather. Still dry. Good for drying laundry, but troubling overall. Chicago desperately needed rain. The wooden buildings, the wooden sidewalks, even the wooden block streets, everything was tinder. The fire department had already responded to 3 significant blazes in the past month. Still, Chen reasoned, that was why the city had firefighters. He went back to his ironing, planning how he'd spend the evening. Maybe he'd write another letter to his wife, telling her about the strange American city where buildings grew like mushrooms after rain but where a Chinese man could, with enough work, carve out a life. Henry Schaefer loaded the last of the day's unsold bread into his cart. He'd give it to St. Michael's Church for distribution to the poor. The church was just 3 blocks away, and Father O'Malley always appreciated the donation. Schaefer had come from Bavaria 20 years ago with nothing but his knowledge of baking and his determination to succeed. Now he owned his own bakery, employed 2 assistants, and had his name painted proudly above his door. His children were growing up speaking English, attending good schools. America had been good to Henry Schaefer. "Beautiful afternoon, Henry," his neighbor called out. "Indeed, indeed. Though we could use rain." Schaefer's German accent flavored his words. He glanced at the sky, clear, painfully blue, not a cloud visible. Well, the rain would come eventually. It always did. Anna Novak shifted her baby to her other hip, trying to soothe the fussy infant while keeping an eye on her 3 other children playing in the street. Her husband Joseph was at the lumber mill, wouldn't be home until dark. Anna was exhausted. The baby had been colicky all week, the older children were restless and quarrelsome, and the small apartment above the cobbler's shop felt increasingly cramped. But she reminded herself of the alternative, the tiny, mud-floored cottage in Bohemia where she'd grown up, where hunger was a constant companion, where her own parents had buried 6 of their 12 children before adulthood. "Mama, can we have candy?" Her 7-year-old daughter tugged at her skirt. "No candy today. Tomorrow maybe." Maybe never, Anna thought, but she kept her voice gentle. Every penny counted. Joseph made decent money at the mill, but 4 children consumed everything. Shoes, food, rent. It never ended. Still, they were together, they were healthy, and in America, hard work meant opportunities. Her children would go to school, learn to read and write, have chances she never had. Timothy O'Brien chased a wooden hoop down the street, laughing as it wobbled and rolled. At 7 years old, he was the youngest of 6 children, and consequently the most spoiled and free. His older siblings had chores, but Timothy was allowed to play until dinner. His father worked as a carter, hauling goods around the city, and his mother took in washing. They weren't wealthy, but they had enough. More importantly, they had each other and their faith and their belief that Chicago, young, growing, full of possibility, was exactly where they were meant to be. "Watch out for the horses," his older sister Mary called from the doorway of their building. Timothy waved acknowledgement but kept playing. The street was his kingdom, familiar and safe. He knew every crack in the wooden sidewalk, every shopkeeper, every neighbor. This was his world, unchanging and eternal, or so it seemed to a 7-year-old boy on a beautiful October afternoon. At the O'Leary property, several blocks from where Hessler was photographing, Catherine O'Leary was finishing her afternoon milking. The Irish immigrant widow was tired. She was always tired these days. 5 children to feed, cows to milk, a tiny cottage that never seemed warm enough in winter or cool enough in summer. Her barn was small but sturdy, and the 5 cows she kept provided milk she could sell to neighbors. It wasn't much of a living, but it was honest work. Her neighbor Daniel Sullivan, no relation to Margaret the seamstress, stopped by to chat. Sullivan had a wooden leg, lost the original in an accident years ago, and sometimes helped Catherine with heavy work around the property in exchange for fresh milk. "Dry as bone," Sullivan commented, gesturing at the brittle grass and parched earth. "We need rain desperate," Catherine agreed in her thick brogue. "The whole city's like kindling. I worry about fire every night." "The fire department's good, though. They'll handle anything that starts." Catherine nodded, but her worry remained. She'd grown up in Ireland hearing stories of the Great Fire of Dublin, had seen what flames could do to crowded, wooden cities. But what could she do? Only pray and be careful with her lanterns and cooking fires. Back on DeCoven Street, Hessler was packing up his equipment, satisfied with the day's work. He'd captured 8 different scenes throughout the day, documenting neighborhoods from the wealthy areas near Michigan Avenue to the working-class streets like this one. The photographs would provide a comprehensive portrait of Chicago in 1871, showing the city's diversity, its energy, its ambition. As he loaded his camera into his wagon, he exchanged pleasantries with several people he'd photographed. Murphy invited him to come back anytime, said he'd be proud to be documented in the city's historical record. Margaret Sullivan had already disappeared into the Peterson boarding house to begin cooking. William Chen had gone back to his ironing. Henry Schaefer was delivering his bread to the church. Anna Novak was herding her children inside for an early dinner. Timothy O'Brien had abandoned his hoop and was now playing marbles with 2 other boys. Hessler climbed onto his wagon seat and snapped the reins, guiding his horse north toward his studio on Lake Street. He'd develop the photographs tomorrow, carefully treating the glass plates in his darkroom, watching the images emerge like ghosts materializing from the chemical baths. Photography was still magic to him, even after 25 years of practice. The ability to freeze time, to capture a moment and preserve it forever. As his wagon rattled over the wooden block pavement, Hessler looked back at the street he'd just photographed. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that they were being documented for posterity. That was the beauty of this kind of photography, the honesty of it, the unposed reality. These weren't formal studio portraits where everyone wore their best clothes and arranged their faces into serious expressions. This was life as it was actually lived. The afternoon wore on. The sun tracked westward, its light turning golden, then amber. Shops began to close. Workmen headed home or to the saloons. Women called children inside for supper. The rhythm of a normal day in a normal American city, the kind of day that had repeated thousands of times before and would repeat thousands of times again. Except this day was different. This day was the last normal day many of these people would ever experience. At approximately 9 o'clock that evening, as the city settled into night, a fire began in or near the O'Leary barn on DeCoven Street. The exact cause would remain disputed. Was it really a cow and a lantern? Or was it careless smoking, or a misbehaving neighbor boy? The truth would never be definitively established. But the result was undeniable and catastrophic. The fire started small, as all fires do. A spark, a flame, a small blaze. But conditions were perfect for disaster. The city hadn't seen significant rain in months. The wooden buildings were parched and dry. A steady southwest wind was blowing. And critically, Chicago's fire alarm system was flawed. The first alarm went to the wrong location, sending fire crews to a completely different neighborhood while the real fire grew unchecked. By the time firefighters reached the actual fire, it had already jumped from the O'Leary barn to neighboring buildings. The flames raced through the densely packed wooden structures like a living thing, hungry and unstoppable. What started as a small barn fire quickly became a neighborhood fire, then a district fire, then a city-wide catastrophe. Patrick Murphy was in his apartment above the dry goods store when his wife shook him awake. "Patrick! Fire! The whole street's burning!" He stumbled to the window, still half asleep, and the sight that met his eyes snapped him into full consciousness. Flames were roaring up the street, building to building, creating a wall of fire that seemed to fill the entire western sky. The heat was already palpable through the window glass. Get the children! Now! Murphy's mind raced. What could they save? His store represented 15 years of work, every penny he'd ever saved or earned. The inventory alone was worth thousands. But there was no time. Leave everything. Just get out. They fled in their nightclothes, Murphy carrying his youngest child, his wife herding the other two. On the street, chaos reigned. People ran in all directions, some trying to fight the flames with bucket brigades, others fleeing with whatever possessions they could carry, still others simply standing frozen in shock. The heat was incredible. Murphy felt his eyebrows singe. The flames were producing winds of their own, creating a roar that made communication nearly impossible. Embers flew through the air like deadly fireflies, starting new fires wherever they landed. A wooden sidewalk plank burst into flame right in front of Murphy's feet. "The bridge! Get to the river!" someone was shouting. Murphy turned back one last time to look at his store. Flames were already licking through the windows. As he watched, the entire facade seemed to simply dissolve into fire. 15 years, gone in minutes. "Come on!" His wife pulled at his arm. They ran north, joining a stream of refugees fleeing the flames. In the Peterson boarding house, Margaret Sullivan had been asleep when the screaming started. She woke to smoke filling her small room, the orange glow of flames visible through her window. The boarding house was already on fire. She could hear the timbers cracking, could feel the heat through the walls. She grabbed her shawl and ran for the hallway. Smoke made breathing nearly impossible. Her eyes streamed with tears. Other boarders were rushing past her, heading for the stairs. Mrs. Peterson was at the far end of the hall, pounding on doors, making sure everyone was awake. "Margaret, get out. The whole building's going." Margaret reached the stairs and started down, But halfway to the ground floor she heard children crying. The McConnell family, the couple with 3 small children in the next building, were they out? The buildings shared a wall. If the boarding house was burning, the McConnell place must be too. Without thinking, Margaret changed direction, heading toward the back exit that connected to the neighboring building. The smoke was thicker here, the heat more intense. She tied her shawl over her mouth and nose and pushed through. The McConnell building was an inferno. The stairs were already engulfed, but Margaret could hear the children crying on the second floor. The parents must have already gotten out, thinking they could come back for the children, or maybe they were outside right now, desperate, unable to reach them. The back staircase, the servants' stairs, might still be passable. Margaret ran through the smoke, found the narrow stairway, started climbing. The heat was unbearable. Her lungs burned. Her eyes couldn't focus. But she could hear those children crying, and something deeper than logic, deeper than self-preservation, drove her upward. She found them huddled in a bedroom, the 3 of them, terrified. The oldest was maybe 5, the youngest still in diapers. Margaret grabbed the baby, told the others to hold onto her nightgown, and started back toward the stairs. Getting down was a nightmare. The smoke was blinding. Margaret couldn't see, could barely breathe. She felt her way along walls, knowing the layout only from having visited the McConnells for tea. The children were coughing, crying. The baby was screaming. Margaret's lungs felt like they were filled with molten metal. They reached the first floor. The front door was completely blocked by flames, but the back door, there. Margaret stumbled toward it, children clutching at her, and burst through into the street. Fresh air. She had never tasted anything so sweet. The children were coughing, crying, but alive. People rushed forward to take them. Margaret saw Mrs. McConnell, hysterical with relief, gathering her children. Someone was asking Margaret if she was all right, but the words seemed to come from very far away. The others, Margaret gasped. There are still people. She turned back toward the buildings. Both structures were now completely engulfed, flames shooting from every window. But she had to try. There had to be more people trapped, more children, more. Margaret took 3 steps toward the inferno before her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the wooden street, her lungs unable to pull in air. Smoke inhalation, though she didn't know the medical term. Her body simply stopped working, shut down by the toxic smoke she'd inhaled during those desperate minutes in the burning building. Someone was turning her over, trying to help. Mrs. Peterson's face appeared above her. Margaret, stay with me now. Don't close your eyes. But Margaret's eyes were already closing. Her last thought was relief that the children were safe. She never felt the moment when her breathing stopped entirely. William Chen was one of the lucky ones, at least initially. His laundry was far enough from the fire's origin that he had time to wake, assess the situation, and make decisions. The problem was that he made the wrong decision. Instead of immediately fleeing, Chen tried to save his business. He hauled out his most expensive equipment, the large pressing machine he'd saved for 2 years to buy, the copper boilers, the supplies. He worked frantically, carrying items into the street, thinking he could save enough to restart his business somewhere else. By the time Chen realized the fire was moving faster than he'd anticipated, it was too late to save much more. He grabbed his cash box, containing 3 years of savings, $247 in gold and silver coins, and joined the fleeing crowds. The refugees from the west side were converging at the Chicago River, hoping the water would stop the flames. But the wind was driving the fire north and east, and embers were already starting fires on the other side of the river. Chen watched in horror as a flying ember landed on a lumber barge moored at the dock. Within minutes, the entire barge was ablaze, and the fire was now burning on both sides of the river. "It's jumping the river," someone screamed. "The whole city's going to burn." Panic intensified. The crowds pushed toward the bridges, desperate to get to what they hoped would be safety on the north side or the south side. Chen was swept along in the human tide, clutching his cash box, watching as everything he'd built in America disappeared behind a wall of flame. Henry Schaefer never made it out of his bakery. When the fire reached his block, he was already there, having returned after delivering his bread to the church. He'd told his wife to take the children and go, said he'd catch up, but he wanted to save his ovens, the expensive, custom-built brick ovens he'd had shipped from Bavaria. The ovens couldn't be moved, of course. They were built into the structure of the building. But Schaefer, in the panic and confusion, couldn't accept that. He'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much. So he stayed, trying desperately to somehow preserve what couldn't be preserved, and the smoke got him. They found his body 3 days later, still in his bakery, still near his beloved ovens. The ovens themselves had survived. Brick doesn't burn, standing like a memorial amid the ashes of everything else. Anna Novak got her children out, all 4 of them. Her husband Joseph was already at home when the fire reached their neighborhood, and together they managed to flee with the children wrapped in blankets. But Joseph had made Anna and the children go ahead while he ran back one more time, not for possessions, but to help his elderly neighbor Mr. Kowalski, who lived alone and couldn't move quickly. Anna waited at the designated meeting point, a park 2 miles north of the fire zone, watching desperately for Joseph. Other refugees streamed past. The sky was bright as day, glowing orange, the smoke so thick it turned the moon blood red. Children cried. Women wept. Men stood in shocked silence, watching their city burn. Joseph never appeared. Anna waited all night, the baby in her arms, the older children huddled against her. Morning came, and still no Joseph. It would be 5 days before she learned that her husband had died in the collapse of a building on Morgan Street, crushed when a burning wall fell on him and Mr. Kowalski. The elderly man survived. Joseph's body had shielded him from the worst of the debris. Timothy O'Brien's story had a happier ending, though it was terrifying in the moment. The O'Brien family fled their home with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Timothy's father carried him on his shoulders, running through streets lit by flames, dodging burning debris, choking on smoke. They made it to the lake shore, where thousands of people had gathered, some actually standing in the water to escape the heat. Timothy would remember that night for the rest of his life, the roar of the flames, the screams of the terrified crowd, the heat so intense that people wet their clothes in the lake and wrapped themselves in soaking fabric just to survive. He would remember his mother praying the rosary over and over, her fingers working the beads frantically. He would remember his father's grim determination, the way he kept saying, "We'll be all right, we'll rebuild, we'll be all right." And the O'Briens were all right, eventually. They survived, found temporary housing, rebuilt. Timothy grew up to become an alderman, and he spent his entire political career advocating for fire safety, building codes, and adequate fire protection. He never forgot the night his city burned. The fire raged for more than 2 days. By the time it finally burned itself out, stopped by a shift in the wind, rain, and the exhaustion of burnable material, it had destroyed more than 3 square miles of the city. 300 people confirmed dead, though the real number was likely much higher. Over 100,000 people were left homeless. Property damage exceeded $200 million in 1871 dollars, billions in today's currency. The area that Alexander Hesseler had photographed on that October afternoon was completely destroyed. Every building, every street, every sidewalk, all gone. If anyone had looked for Murphy's Dry Goods or Callahan's Tobacco or Chen's Laundry or Schaefer's Bakery, they would have found only ashes and blackened rubble. But somewhere in his studio on Lake Street, in a storage cabinet that by sheer luck remained on the edge of the burned area and was saved by desperate firefighting efforts, Hesseler's glass plate negatives survived. He wouldn't even remember he had them for several months. He had far more pressing concerns in the aftermath of the fire, like rebuilding his livelihood and helping his community recover. The DeKoven Street photograph sat in its protective sleeve, forgotten, a ghost image of a world that no longer existed. What we're looking at, Dr. Rebecca Martinez told the assembled crowd at the Chicago Historical Society's public lecture hall, is the only known photograph of this particular area taken before the fire. It is, quite literally, the last visual record of these people, these buildings, this moment in time. The lecture hall was packed. Word of the discovery had spread quickly. Local news had covered it extensively. National media had picked it up. People were fascinated by the image, by the ordinariness of it, by the unknowing faces of people standing hours before catastrophe. Rebecca advanced the slide presentation, showing a high-resolution scan of the photograph alongside modern photographs of the same location. Where bustling streets once stood, there was now a community center and a small memorial park. Chicago had been rebuilt, of course, rebuilt bigger, better, with stone and steel instead of wood. But the pre-fire city was gone, survived only in memory and in precious few photographs like this one. We've been able to identify most of the people visible in the photograph, Thomas Chin continued, taking over the presentation. And their stories form a cross-section of immigrant Chicago, of working-class Chicago, of the American dream in all its hope and tragedy. He advanced to a slide showing close-ups of individual faces from the photograph, each labeled with names and brief biographical details. Patrick Murphy, Irish immigrant, age 43, lost his business but survived and rebuilt in Milwaukee. Margaret Sullivan, Irish immigrant, age 28, died saving 3 children from the McConnell family. The children survived because of her sacrifice. William Chen, Chinese immigrant, age 25, lost his business and his savings but eventually re-established himself in San Francisco's Chinatown. Henry Schaefer, German immigrant, age 51, died trying to save his bakery. Anna Novak, Czech immigrant, age 31, lost her husband but raised her 4 children alone. Her grandson is in the audience today. An elderly man in the third row nodded acknowledgement when the audience turned to look at him. Martin Novak had traveled from Milwaukee to attend the lecture, had been one of the first people Rebecca contacted when she identified his great-grandmother in the photograph. Looking at this photograph, Rebecca said, we see the Chicago that existed before the fire transformed the city. And were struck by several things. First, the incredible diversity. Chicago in 1871 was already a city of immigrants, Irish, German, Chinese, Czech, Polish, Scandinavian. They came for opportunity, for work, for a chance at something better than what they left behind. Second, we see the vulnerability. Every structure in this image is wood. The streets are wood. The sidewalks are wood. In drought conditions, with wind, it was a disaster waiting to happen. And third, we see the ordinariness of their lives. She paused, looking at the photograph projected large on the screen. That's what makes this image so powerful. These aren't historical figures. They're not famous. They're just people living their lives, working, shopping, raising children, trying to get by. And the photograph captures them in their last moments of normalcy before everything changed. A hand went up in the audience. What happened to the photographer, Alexander Hesseler? Thomas fielded the question. Hesseler lost his studio in the fire, along with most of his life's work. But these glass plates somehow survived, probably because they were stored in a part of the building that was saved. Hesseler himself survived, rebuilt his business, and continued working as a photographer until his death in 1895. He probably never realized the historical significance of this particular photograph. It was just another commission, another day's work. Another question, how did the photograph end up in Dorothy Brennan's possession? We believe Dorothy's grandfather, Michael Brennan, purchased it from Hesseler's estate after his death, Rebecca answered. Brennan was a collector of Chicago memorabilia. He had dozens of photographs, documents, and artifacts from pre-fire Chicago. The collection was kept in the family, passed down through generations, and largely forgotten until Dorothy's grandson found it after her death. The lecture continued for another hour, with Rebecca and Thomas presenting their research, answering questions, and sharing their passion for this moment of captured history. But it was during the informal reception afterward that the most moving moment occurred. Martin Novak approached Rebecca with tears in his eyes. "My great-grandmother Anna," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I never knew her. She died before I was born. But my grandmother told me stories. How Anna came to America alone, just 17 years old. How she met my great-grandfather Joseph at a church social. How he died in the fire, and she had to raise 4 children by herself, taking in laundry, doing whatever work she could find. How she never remarried, said Joseph was the only man she'd ever love. And here," he gestured at the photograph. "Here she is, just a young woman carrying her baby, with no idea what was coming. It's like seeing a ghost." "A living ghost," Rebecca said gently. "In this photograph, she's alive, vibrant, real. The fire couldn't erase her. This image survived, and through it she survived. Her story survived. My grandmother always said Anna was the strongest woman she ever knew, Martin continued. She lived another 46 years after the fire. She saw Chicago rebuilt. She saw her children grow up, become successful. She saw her grandchildren born. She survived heartbreak that would have broken most people. And it all started here, in this moment, captured in this photograph. Over the following months, the photograph generated significant attention. The Chicago Historical Society created a permanent exhibit around it, displaying the enlarged image alongside maps, survivor accounts, and artifacts from the fire. Local schools used it as an educational tool, teaching students about immigration, urban development, fire safety, and historical documentation. Descendants of other people in the photograph came forward with their own family stories, adding depth and detail to the historical record. Dr. James Whitmore published a paper in the Journal of American History arguing that the photograph represented a crucial document for understanding pre-fire Chicago. We tend to think of the Great Chicago Fire as solely destructive, he wrote. But by destroying the wooden city, it forced the rebuilding of a modern city with better materials, better planning, better infrastructure. This photograph shows us what was lost. Not just buildings, but an entire way of life, an entire version of Chicago that can never be recreated. It's a reminder that progress often comes through destruction, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't mourn what was lost. Rebecca found herself reflecting on this idea as she stood alone in the archive late one night, studying the photograph once more. She'd spent months with this image, had examined every detail, had researched every face. But it never stopped affecting her. These people, frozen in that October afternoon, represented something essential about the American experience: hope, struggle, resilience, tragedy, survival. Margaret Sullivan, who died saving children. Would she have hesitated if she'd known the consequence? Rebecca doubted it. Some people simply acted when action was needed, regardless of risk. Henry Schaefer, unable to let go of his life's work even as it killed him. Was that foolish or admirable? Perhaps both. Anna Novak, who survived, who persevered, who built a life from ashes, literally. Her strength had rippled forward through generations. Martin Novak existed because his great-grandmother refused to surrender. And the others, the ones who survived with their losses, who moved to other cities, who rebuilt, who started over. Chicago survived the fire because people like Patrick Murphy and William Chen refused to give up. They lost everything and kept going. That was the real story of the fire, Rebecca realized. Not the destruction, but the refusal to let destruction be the final word. The photograph itself became a symbol. When Chicago politicians debated fire safety regulations, they referenced it. When architects designed new buildings, they kept images of those wooden structures in mind as a cautionary tale. When historians studied urban development, they used it as a case study in vulnerability and resilience. But beyond its scholarly and political uses, the photograph served a more personal purpose for many Chicagoans. It was a connection to ancestors, to roots, to the city's history. People would stand in front of it at the museum, searching the faces, wondering if that could be their great-great-grandfather, their great-great-great-grandmother. Even if they found no familial connection, they found something else, a recognition of shared humanity, of the fragility of life, of the moment-to-moment existence that could be changed instantly by forces beyond anyone's control. On the 150th anniversary of the Great Chicago Fire, October 8, 2021, the city held memorial ceremonies. Rebecca was invited to speak at the event, held at the site where the fire began. A permanent memorial had been erected years before, but for this special anniversary, officials had arranged for a large-scale projection of Hessler's photograph onto a nearby building. As darkness fell and the projection illuminated the wall, showing those faces from 1871 larger than life, the crowd fell silent. Then someone began to read names. The names of the dead, the names of the survivors, the names of the forgotten and the remembered. Margaret Sullivan, Henry Schaefer, Joseph Novak, hundreds more. Each name a story, each story a thread in the fabric of the city's history. What strikes me about this photograph Rebecca said when it was her turn to speak, is its timing. It was taken mere hours before catastrophe. If Hessler had been there the next day, he would have found only ruins. If he'd come the day before, it would have been just another photograph among thousands. But he was there at that exact moment, at that precise intersection of normal life and impending disaster, and he captured it. He gave us a window into the last moments of a vanished world. She paused, looking at the projected image. But I think the photograph's real power isn't about timing or luck or historical significance. It's about reminding us that every ordinary moment is precious. These people didn't know they were standing at a historical crossroads. They were just living their lives, the exact same lives they'd lived the day before and expected to live the next day. That's how life works for all of us. We move through our days assuming tomorrow will come, assuming the structures of our lives are solid, assuming we'll have time to do the things we mean to do, to say the things we mean to say. The crowd was listening intently now, seeing their own lives reflected in those faces from 150 years ago. The fire took everything from these people, their homes, their businesses, their possessions. For some, it took their lives. But it couldn't take their humanity. It couldn't erase their courage, their love, their determination. Margaret Sullivan died, but the children she saved lived. Henry Schaefer died, but his family rebuilt. Joseph Novak died, but his wife raised their children, and those children built lives, and now their descendants stand here tonight. The fire destroyed a city, but it didn't destroy the people. They rebuilt, better and stronger. That's the real legacy of October 8, 1871. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, many lingered, looking up at the projected photograph. Parents explained to children what they were seeing. Elderly people shared memories of their grandparents' stories about the fire. Young people took photos with their phones, posting the historical image to social media, sharing it with friends and followers across the world. The photograph had transcended its physical form. It was no longer just a historical artifact stored in an archive. It had become a living document, a teaching tool, a memorial, a warning, and an inspiration. It connected present to past, reminded the living of the dead, and testified to the permanence of human impact despite the impermanence of human life. Rebecca watched people interact with the image and felt a deep satisfaction. This was why she'd chosen her career, why she spent long hours in archives sifting through forgotten documents. History wasn't just dates and events, it was people with real lives, and every artifact, every photograph, every preserved document was a voice calling across time, saying, I existed. I mattered. Remember me. The photograph of DeKoven Street on October 8, 1871, said all of that. It said we were here. We lived. We laughed and worked and worried about ordinary things. Disaster came, but we survived. If not in body, then in memory, in descendants, in the city we built and rebuilt. We matter. Our lives mattered. Don't forget us. And thanks to Alexander Hessler's photograph, discovered in an attic 150 years later and brought to light by dedicated historians, no one would forget. The faces would endure. The story would continue. The testimony of these ghosts would echo forward through time, reminding future generations of their shared humanity, their shared vulnerability, and their shared strength. As Rebecca walked home that night through the streets of modern Chicago, streets of steel and stone, streets designed to resist fire, streets that bore little physical resemblance to the wooden pathways of 1871, she felt the presence of those earlier Chicagoans. They had walked these same blocks, had looked at the same sky, had breathed the same air. They had built a city from nothing, had lost it to flames, and had built it again, even better. Their Chicago was gone, but their spirit remained. It remained in every building that stood, in every life that was lived, in every person who chose resilience over surrender. The photograph had captured one moment, but it preserved something eternal, the human capacity to face disaster, to mourn loss, to honor the dead, and then to rebuild, to continue, to hope. That was the real lesson of October 8, 1871. Not that disaster comes, but that after disaster, life continues. The photograph showed the before. History recorded the during, but the city itself, vibrant, growing, thriving Chicago, demonstrated the after. And in that continuing story, the faces in Alexander Hesseler's photograph would always have their place, forever young, forever alive, forever witnesses to the moment when everything changed.